Probably the most dramatic occurrence in the history of veterinary practice was the disappearance of the draught horse. It is an almost incredible fact that this glory and mainstay of the profession just melted quietly away within a few years. And I was one of those who were there to see it happen. When I first came to Derby, the tractor had already begun to take over, but tradition dies hard in the agricultural world, and there were still a lot of horses around. Which was just as well, because my veterinary education had been geared to things equine, with everything else a poor second. It had been a good scientific education in many respects, but at times I wondered if the people who designed it still had a mental picture of the horse doctor with his top hat and frock coat, busying himself in a world of horse-drawn trams and brewers' drays. We learned the anatomy of the horse in great detail, then that of the other animals much more superficially. It was the same with the other subject. From animal husbandry with such insistence on a thorough knowledge of shoeing that we developed into amateur blacksmiths, right up to medicine and surgery, where it was much more important to know about glanders and strangles than canine distemper. Even as we were learning, we youngsters knew it was ridiculous with the draught horse already cast as a museum piece, and the obvious potential of cattle and small animal work. I was 17, and I was walking under the arch of the veterinary college into Montrose Street. I had been a student for 3 days, but not until this afternoon had I felt the thrill of fulfillment. Messing about with botany and zoology was all right, but this afternoon had been the real thing. I had had my first lecture in animal husbandry. The subject had been the points of the horse. Professor Grant had hung up a life-size picture of a horse and had gone over it from nose to tail, indicating the withers, the stifle, the hock, the pole, and all the other rich equine terms. And the professor had been wise. To make his lecture more interesting, he kept throwing in little practical points like, "This is where we find curb," or "Here is the site for wind galls." He talked of thoroughpins and side bones, splints and quitter, things the students wouldn't learn for another 4 years, but he brought it all to life. The words were still spinning in my head as I walked slowly down the sloping street. This was what I had come for. I felt as though I had undergone an initiation and become a member of an exclusive club. I really knew about horses. And I was wearing a brand new riding mac, with all sorts of extra straps and buckles which slapped against my legs as I turned the corner of the hill into busy Newton Road. I could hardly believe my luck when I saw the horse. It was standing outside the library, below Queen's Cross, like something left over from another age. It drooped dispiritedly between the shafts of a coal cart, which stood like an island in an eddying stream of cars and buses. Pedestrians hurried by uncaring, but I had the feeling that fortune was smiling on me. A horse. Not just a picture, but a real, genuine horse. Stray words from the lecture floated up into my mind. The pastern, cannon bone, coronet, and all those markings, snip, blaze, white sock near hind. I stood on the pavement and examined the animal critically. I thought it must be obvious to every passer-by that here was a true expert, not just an inquisitive onlooker, but a man who knew and understood all. I felt clothed in a visible aura of horsiness. I took a few steps up and down, hands deep in the pockets of the new riding mac, eyes probing for possible shoeing faults or curbs or bog spavins. So thorough was my inspection that I worked round to the offside of the horse and stood perilously among the racing traffic. I glanced around at the people hurrying past. Nobody seemed to care, not even the horse. He was a large one, at least 17 hands, and he gazed apathetically down the street, easing his hind legs alternately in a bored manner. I hated to leave him, but I had completed my examination and it was time I was on my way. But I felt that I ought to make a gesture before I left. Something to communicate to the horse that I understood his problems and that we belonged to the same brotherhood. I stepped briskly forward and patted him on the neck. Quick as a striking snake, the horse whipped downwards and seized my shoulder in his great, strong teeth. He laid back his ears, rolled his eyes wickedly, and hoisted me up, almost off my feet, I hung there helplessly, suspended like a lopsided puppet. I wriggled and kicked, but the teeth were clamped immovably in the material of my coat. There was no doubt about the interest of the passers-by now. The grotesque sight of a man hanging from a horse's mouth brought them to a sudden halt, and a crowd formed, with people looking over each other's shoulders and others fighting at the back to see what was going on. A horrified old lady was crying, "Oh, poor boy, help him, somebody!" Some of the braver characters tried pulling at me, but the horse whickered ominously and hung on tighter. Conflicting advice was shouted from all sides. With deep shame, I saw two attractive girls in the front row giggling helplessly. Appalled at the absurdity of my position, I began to thrash about wildly. My shirt collar tightened round my throat. A stream of the horse's saliva trickled down the front of my mac. I could feel myself choking and was giving up hope when a man pushed his way through the crowd. He was very small. Angry eyes glared from a face blackened by coal dust. 2 empty sacks were draped over an arm. "What the hell's this?" he shouted. A dozen replies babbled in the air. "Can you no leave the bloody horse alone?" he yelled into my face. I made no reply, being pop-eyed, half-throttled, and in no mood for conversation. The coalman turned his fury on the horse. "Drop him, you big bastard! Go on, let go! Drop him!" Getting no response, he dug the animal viciously in the belly with his thumb. The horse took the point at once and released me like an obedient dog dropping a bone. I fell on my knees and ruminated in the gutter for a while, till I could breathe more easily. As from a great distance I could still hear the little man shouting at me. After some time I stood up. The coalman was still shouting and the crowd was listening appreciatively. "What do you think you're playing at? Keep your hands off my bloody horse! Get the police to you!" I looked down at my new Mac. The shoulder was chewed to a sodden mass. I felt I must escape and began to edge my way through the crowd. Some of the faces were concerned, but most were grinning. Once clear, I started to walk away rapidly, and as I turned the corner, the last faint cry from the coalman reached me. "Dinna meddle with things ye ken nothing about!"